They were still laughing when the truck pulled away. Three men stood at the edge of a gravel lot outside a county equipment auction in western Kansas, watching a beat-up flatbed rattle down the road with a rusted, bent, grease-caked machine strapped to the back. The paint on it had worn down to bare metal decades ago. One of its cast iron legs was cracked and wired back together. A hand crank hung loose on one side, missing its wooden handle entirely. $47, one of the men said, shaking his head. He just spent his last $47 on scrap. Another laughed under his breath. That thing hasn't turned a crank since before his daddy was born. They weren't cruel men. They were successful men. Third and fourth generation wheat farmers who ran thousands of acres between them. Men who had modern equipment worth more than most houses. To them, the sight of a young farmer hauling home a forgotten, half-broken relic wasn't malicious amusement. It was pity. They genuinely believed they were watching a man make one more mistake in a long string of mistakes that would eventually put him out of business, same as it had put out half a dozen small operations in the county over the past decade. 7 years later, those same men would sit across a folding table from that same young farmer, signing over acreage their families had worked for generations, because he was the only buyer left standing with cash in hand. Nobody could explain exactly how it happened. Not right away. The machine itself was never worth much. What it allowed him to see, that was worth everything. If you enjoy real farm stories that reveal the forgotten knowledge behind rural success, subscribe to this channel. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your country, state, or province in the comments below. And stay with us, because what this farmer discovered inside that rusted machine changed the way an entire region thought about wheat. His name was Wyatt Calloway, and at the time of the auction, he was 34 years old, running 160 acres that had once been part of a much larger family operation. His grandfather had farmed close to 1,000 acres through the 1960s and 70s, a respected name in the county. But the farm crisis of the 1980s had gutted the operation the way it gutted thousands of family farms across the Great Plains, crushing debt, collapsing land values, foreclosures that emptied out entire townships. By the time Wyatt's father inherited what remained, there wasn't much left to inherit. By the time it came to Wyatt, there was even less. What Wyatt did have was a set of hands that understood machinery the way some people understand language. His father had taught him to weld before he was 10 years old, working alongside him in a drafty pole barn on winter afternoons, patching together equipment that should have been retired a decade earlier because there was never money for anything new. Necessity had made Wyatt resourceful in a way that couldn't be taught in any classroom. He could diagnose a failing bearing by sound alone. He could rebuild a fuel pump with parts scavenged from 3 different broken machines. Neighbors sometimes called him for help with equipment repairs, quietly, almost embarrassed to need it, because everyone in that county understood, without saying it out loud, that Wyatt Calloway was land poor and cash poor in a way that made people uncomfortable. The wealthy farmers in the area, men like Dale Hendrickson and his 2 brothers, who together controlled nearly 6,000 acres of prime wheat ground, weren't villains in this story. They simply operated in a different world. Their farms ran on economies of scale, massive combines, GPS-guided planting, grain contracts negotiated months in advance, enough capital reserved to survive a bad year without blinking. From where they stood, a young farmer spending his last dollars on a broken antique wasn't a curiosity. It was a warning sign. They'd seen that pattern before, and it usually ended the same way. A bank auction, a for sale sign, another quarter section absorbed into someone else's operation. Wyatt didn't buy the machine because he had a plan. He bought it because something about it wouldn't let him walk away. The machine was a seed cleaner and grater, a heavy, hand-cranked cast-iron device manufactured sometime in the early 1930s, designed to separate wheat kernels by size, weight, and density using a series of vibrating screens and adjustable air blowers. In its era, it had been standard equipment on family farms across the plains, used to clean harvested grain of chaff, weed seed, and broken kernels before it went to market, or was saved as seed stock for the following year. By the time large-scale industrial grain elevators took over that function in the second half of the 20th century, machines like it had become obsolete almost overnight, too slow, too manual, too small in volume for a farming world that had shifted entirely toward speed and scale. Wyatt hauled it home, set it up in the same drafty pole barn where he'd learned to weld, and spent the better part of 2 months getting it running again. He rebuilt the crank mechanism from scratch. He replaced 2 rotted screens with mesh he cut and shaped by hand. He rewired the tensioning bolts that adjusted airflow across the grading chamber. Every evening after a full day in the fields, he'd work under a single hanging shop light until well past midnight, grease under his fingernails, cold coffee going untouched on the workbench beside him. His neighbors, when they noticed the activity in his barn, assumed he was restoring it as some kind of hobby, a nostalgic tribute to the old days, maybe something to display at a county fair. Nobody imagined it as anything more than that. Frankly, for a long while, neither did Wyatt. What changed his thinking was a conversation with his grandmother the following spring, while sorting through a box of his late grandfather's farm records. Buried among yellowed ledgers and faded receipts, she found an old photograph of Wyatt's grandfather standing beside a nearly identical machine, sacks of clean, hand-graded seed wheat stacked beside him. She explained something Wyatt had never fully understood before, that in his grandfather's era, farmers who took the time to properly clean and grade their own seed, kernel by kernel, consistently grew better crops than those who simply planted whatever came out of the combine. Uniform seed size meant uniform germination. Uniform germination meant uniform ripening. And back before industrial elevators blended everyone's grain together into one anonymous commodity stream, a farmer's reputation for consistent, high-quality wheat could command a premium price from mills willing to pay for it. That conversation planted something in Wyatt's mind that took months to fully take root. The first year, nothing about Wyatt's situation improved. If anything, it got harder. A dry spring cut his wheat yield by nearly a third. The bank, reviewing his thin financial history and modest acreage, turned down his application for an operating loan that would have covered new seed and fertilizer for the following season. He patched together enough credit through a farm supply co-op to get by, but just barely. 2 of his neighbors, watching him struggle, gently suggested it might be time to consider leasing his ground to one of the larger operations and taking steady work elsewhere. It wasn't unkind advice. It was practical advice, the kind offered by people who had watched enough small farms fail to recognize the early signs. Wyatt kept the machine running anyway. That fall, instead of selling his entire harvest into the standard commodity grain stream, the way every other farmer in the county did, Wyatt set aside roughly 1/10 of his crop and ran it, kernel by kernel, through the restored grader. It took him nearly 3 full weeks of evenings to process what a modern combine could have handled in an afternoon. But what came out the other end was something he hadn't quite expected, a remarkably uniform batch of hard red winter wheat, cleaned of nearly all foreign material, graded by size and density into a consistency he had never seen in his own bins before. He didn't know exactly what to do with it. So he did the only thing that made sense to a man with almost no money and almost no other options. He loaded 50 pounds of it into the back of his truck and drove 2 hours to a small artisan bakery in the nearest city that he'd read about in a farm magazine, one of a growing number of bakeries across the country, experimenting with whole grain, single-origin flour instead of generic commercial blends. The baker, a woman named Renata Ibarra, was skeptical at first. She milled a small test batch on her own stone mill, baked a few loaves, and called Wyatt back 3 days later, not with polite interest, but with genuine excitement. The flour milled from his hand-graded wheat produced a noticeably different loaf, better rise, more complex flavor, a texture her regular commercial flour simply couldn't match. She wanted more. She wanted, in fact, all of it he could produce. This is where most people assume the story turns into overnight success. It didn't. Real agricultural transformation almost never does. What Wyatt had stumbled into, without fully realizing it yet, was the leading edge of a broader shift happening quietly across the country during that decade. A growing market of small, independent mills and artisan bakeries willing to pay significantly above commodity prices for grain that met specific quality standards, grown and processed with traceable care, rather than blended anonymously into massive industrial grain elevators where a farmer's individual effort simply disappeared into an undifferentiated pool. Economists studying the sector would later describe this as the value-added agriculture movement, the recognition that a farmer selling raw commodity grain was, almost by definition, capturing the smallest possible share of the final product's value, while every processing step downstream captured more. Wyatt didn't know the economic terminology yet. He just knew Renata was willing to pay nearly double the elevator price for wheat that met her standards, and that his old machine was the only reason he could reliably produce it. The second year, he expanded, not recklessly, but carefully. He set aside a larger portion of his harvest for hand grading, working through the winter months to process it in batches. He reached out to 2 more small bakeries in neighboring states, sending samples, building relationships slowly through phone calls and follow-up visits, learning as he went what different bakers actually wanted. Some prioritized protein content for artisan bread. Others wanted specific heirloom varieties with distinct flavor profiles, nearly impossible to find through standard commercial channels. He began experimenting, alongside his primary crop, with small test plots of heritage wheat varieties his grandfather had once grown. Turkey Red, Marquis, varieties largely abandoned decades earlier in favor of higher-yield hybrid strains bred for industrial-scale production rather than flavor or milling quality. These older varieties yielded less per acre, but they commanded prices high enough to more than make up the difference, once buyers understood what they were getting. Every obstacle along the way felt ordinary, almost mundane, the way real struggle usually does. A late frost damaged one of his heritage test plots entirely. A batch of flour arrived at a bakery in Colorado, with moisture content slightly too high, and Wyatt drove 6 hours to personally apologize and replace the order at his own cost, understanding that trust, once damaged in a market this small and relationship-driven, was nearly impossible to rebuild. A local seed supplier initially refused to sell him heritage wheat seed stock at all, assuming, like everyone else, that he was chasing a passing fad rather than building something sustainable. But slowly, methodically, over roughly 5 years, Wyatt's small operation shifted from a struggling commodity farm, barely surviving on the margins, into something else entirely, a specialty grain operation supplying a growing network of independent mills and bakeries across 3 states, commanding prices that, acre for acre, dwarfed what his neighbors were earning from standard commodity wheat. The wealthy farmers in the county noticed, eventually, though most of them still didn't fully understand what they were seeing. They assumed Wyatt had simply gotten lucky finding a niche buyer. Few of them grasped that what he'd actually built was a fundamentally different business model, one built on quality, traceability, and direct relationships rather than volume and commodity pricing, one that insulated him, to a significant degree, from the wild price swings that dictated everyone else's fortunes. That insulation mattered more than anyone could have predicted, when commodity wheat prices collapsed sharply during a punishing multi-year stretch that began roughly 6 years after Wyatt's original auction purchase. A combination of oversupply, shifting global trade dynamics, and a series of disappointing harvests drove commodity prices down to levels that made large-scale conventional wheat farming barely profitable, and in some cases actively unprofitable, for operations carrying significant debt. The Hendrickson brothers, like many large operations across the region, had financed their expansion over the previous decade with substantial borrowed capital, a common and often reasonable strategy during years of strong prices, but a dangerous one when those prices fell and stayed low. Interest payments that had once been manageable became crushing. Equipment loans came due. Land that had been purchased at peak values now sat as collateral worth considerably less than what was owed against it. Wyatt, meanwhile, carrying almost no debt and earning steady, above-market prices from his specialty grain contracts, found himself in the unusual position of having accumulated real savings during the very years his larger neighbors were bleeding money. Nobody in the county saw the shift coming, and it didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most real economic reversals happen, quietly, over a difficult stretch of seasons, one strained conversation with a loan officer at a time. When Dale Hendrickson finally decided to sell off a portion of his family's land to relieve mounting debt pressure, he wasn't thinking about the young farmer down the road who'd bought a broken machine for $47 7 years earlier. He was thinking about survival. He put out feelers quietly, the way struggling operations often do, hoping to avoid the public embarrassment of a foreclosure auction. Wyatt was one of very few buyers in the county with the cash reserves to make a serious offer without financing contingencies, without delays, without the kind of drawn-out negotiation that comes with borrowed money. When he sat down across the table from Dale Hendrickson, there was no triumph in the room. No mention of that auction lot from years earlier. Just two farmers, one buying and one selling, handling a transaction that reflected years of very different decisions finally coming due. Wyatt didn't buy the land to prove anything. He bought it because it made sound business sense, because his specialty grain operation had grown to the point where additional acreage, planted partly in heritage wheat, partly in conventional grain to balance risk, was the logical next step. Word spread through the county quickly, the way it always does. Some framed it as poetic justice. Wyatt himself never described it that way. When a local newspaper reporter asked him directly whether he felt vindicated, watching farmers who once doubted him now selling him their land, he reportedly just shrugged and said the machine had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had simply shown him what was possible if he paid closer attention than everyone else to something most people had stopped valuing entirely. The old seed grader still sits in that same pole barn today, no longer doing the bulk of the work. Modern, larger-scale equipment handles most of Wyatt's grain processing now, but still occasionally used for small specialty batches destined for his most demanding bakery clients, the ones who specifically request grain processed the traditional way. The truth, in the end, was never really about the machine. $47 bought a piece of rusted cast iron that, by itself, was worth almost nothing. What it unlocked was a farmer's willingness to look closely at something everyone else had discarded, to understand a piece of agricultural knowledge his own family had once possessed and lost, and to rebuild an entire business around the patient, unglamorous work of doing something better than anyone else was willing to do. Knowledge, it turns out, has always been the rarest crop on the plains. Everything else, the land, the machinery, the money, has only ever been what grows from it.